Hi, I'm Claire Mitchell, QC. Welcome to the Witches of Scotland podcast. I'm a lawyer who specialises in miscarriage of justice cases, and we're bringing you this podcast because we want to tell you about the women who were accused, prosecuted, convicted, and ultimately executed as witches in Scotland.
I'm Zoe Venditozzi, and I'm a writer who's always had an interest in the witches, and I feel that this dark mark against Scotland needs a reckoning.
The campaign Witches of Scotland wants three things. Firstly, a pardon for all those convicted of witchcraft. Secondly, an apology for all those who were accused as witches. And finally, a national monument in recognition of all those who were affected by this terrible miscarriage of justice.
Over the forthcoming weeks, we'll be talking to a whole host of experts about the history and the modern day connections to the Witches of Scotland. Hello and welcome to episode 16 of the Witches of Scotland podcast. Today, Claire and I are going to be talking about a few things that have come up through the channels of social media that are super interesting. And we're going to talk to you about our upcoming guests for the show.
Yeah, we've been actually doing quite a lot of work behind the scenes since the new year, haven't we, about arranging new guests and plans for the future.
Yes, absolutely. It's really interesting the amount of people that get in touch with us via our social media, particularly through Twitter. And it's brilliant because it just shows that people are engaging and they're interested and their own research comes to us so we can share it with our listeners.
First, as ever, we'll speak about some people that were accused of witchcraft and trying to bring you as much of their story as possible. The first person we don't know very much about, her name is Janet Stewart. She was brought to trial on the 12th of November 1597 at Edinburgh's Canongate. She was female, she was unmarried, she went to trial and she was executed. So the Canongate in Edinburgh was where Edinburgh held lots of its prisoners, or all of its prisoners really, for central Edinburgh. So no doubt Janet would have been held there, tortured till she confessed, then executed on the 12th of November 1597. So that's all we know about poor Janet's history. We know, however, a wee bit more about the next two people that we're going to discuss in relation to witchcraft, don't we, Zoe?
Yeah, well, the first one is moving right away from Edinburgh up to Orkney, the Orkney Islands, is the terrible case, like really, really appalling. I know that every single one of these witchcraft cases is appalling, but this one's particularly disturbing, is about Alison Balfour, who was accused up in Orkney. So her name was Alison Balfour of Stenness, and she was accused of being involved in a plot to murder one of the Orkney Earls, Patrick Stewart, who apparently was quite notorious. And his brother was said to be behind the plan to kill him via poisoning. And then that led to his servant, Thomas Papley, being captured and imprisoned. And he was kept for 11 days and 11 nights and was tortured in a particularly horrific, I suppose all torture instruments are horrific by nature, but a particularly horrific instrument called the cachalot, which was this frame made out of iron that was heated up until it burned into the skin of the person who was inside basically the cage. And so that this man was burned and tortured in that way until eventually he did confess, which I suppose really anybody would. It's really horrifying.
Sorry, Zoe, so can I just check for all of us, he confessed to being involved somehow
in the murder plot.
In a murder plot to murder his boss's brother.
Yes. Okay. So a little bit convoluted, but they obviously got him, I suppose, before they were able to get the brother. And hopefully, I think by breaking him down, I suppose the expectation was that he would then name other people involved in the plot. Okay. So he was tortured until he confessed. While he was confessing, they did various other things to him that I don't think we need to go through too much because it's too horrifying. But he then named what's quoted as the known notorious witch Alison Balfour as an accomplice in this murder plot. So Alison was taken and from the very beginning pleaded her innocence. Okay, so she was very, very strong and steadfast. I don't know how she did this. So again, they used the torture device, and they were obviously very keen to get as much so-called evidence as they could to get Patrick's brothers implicated and then charged so they get them out of the way. So there was a man called Henry Colville, who was the parson of Orford, and Earl Patrick Stewart's close friend and Chamberlain. So he was the man that was in charge of I'm going to call it an investigation into Alison's supposed misdemeanours. So Colville was particularly interested in something that was found in Alison Balfour's possession, which was a piece of wax. And they said that it had been given to her by Patrick Bellenden, the Laird of Stenness. I suppose they're thinking must have been that the wax was in some way a devil's instrument or something like that. Maybe they thought that it was a puppet or something. I'm not sure. But she said that was a perfectly clear explanation for it. It was a bit of like folk medicine, but they didn't believe her and felt that it was something sinister.
So again, I just want to check that what's happened is this woman, out of the blue, having no connection with these people whatsoever, had been called part of the plot and a witch. The person against whom the murder plot was taken, their pal then was Mr. Colville, who started investigating the case.
Absolutely.
So about as far from independent and impartial as you could possibly get. And he picks up something effectively innocent in this woman's house and attributes some kind of demonic involvement or witchy significance to this item. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. And really, it's obviously just a simple way of, well, not simple perhaps, but a way of linking Alison to Patrick Bellenden, who is somebody that they want to implicate in the murder plot, basically. So because it was something that Patrick Bellenden, the Laird of Stenness, had given to her, she said it was to cure a stomach problem in Lady Bellenden. But obviously the torturers said, no, this proves that there's a link there and that you were involved in this nefarious plot to kill the Earl. So obviously in their mind thought, or it was convenient for them to think anyway, that she was involved in this. They spirited her away to Kirkwall Castle and of course started the torture on her because she was still maintaining her innocence. So just like Papley, she was put into the cachalots, her legs were put in there. She spent 48 hours being tortured. So remember, that's where they heated up the metal and they burned the skin of the person that was imprisoned within that device. So she was in there for 48 hours and she still wouldn't confess because she was innocent, okay? Then they got her 81-year-old husband and her 2 children, and they then proceeded to torture the husband by putting him, at the age of 81, in the Lang irons, which is a device that was designed to crush the victims. And they put 700 pounds of weight in stones on top of the old man, but Alison still remained very clear that she was innocent, had nothing to do with it.
And obviously the father of the children, her husband, and the children, these were complete innocents in the sense that nobody was suggesting that they'd been doing anything at all. But they were being tortured in order to make her confess.
Absolutely, which is just it's amazing. You know, the thought that somebody thought that it was okay, and you know, for the guy Colville to be in charge, he is a parson, so you know, a man of God in theory, I suppose. And the idea that he then masterminded a plan of, right, well, we're not getting her to tell us what he wants, so we're going to get her really elderly husband. And like to be 81 in the 1500s, I mean, that's amazing that he reached that age. Absolutely. But then to him, their kids. So the husband was tortured. She still wouldn't admit to any wrongdoing. And then they brought her son in. Now, we don't know how old the son was, but he had his legs placed in what's called here the boots. And they drove wedges into the device, crushing the victim's foot and leg. They put 57 strokes of the mallet to push in the wedges, but I mean into her son's feet, which is just amazing that anybody thought that was okay, but she still wouldn't confess. And then finally, they're obviously thinking, right, we'll do the most awful thing of all. They bring in her 7-year-old daughter and they put her fingers into something that they called pinnywinkies, which was a thumbscrew. And it was at that point when she saw her 7-year-old daughter being tortured after her son, after her elderly husband, that Alison broke down and she confessed to being a witch. The confession then, must have been delighted, was secured, and she was sentenced to die at Heading Hill, which is, it says here, presumably Gallow Ha in Kirkwall, on December the 15th, 1594. And before she died, when she was about to be executed, she retracted her confession and said that she'd issued it only to spare her husband and her children further torture. But of course, the execution went ahead. She was strangled and burned at the stake. So, I mean, it's just it's just so disgusting and so inhumane that this whole thing happened. You know, like you're pointing out here, it was just, she was a tenuous link because they wanted to stitch somebody else up for a murder plot against somebody powerful. They brought in their pal to get involved with it, a supposed man of God. They then torture her family just to basically get what they wanted, sort of, I suppose, politically. So that's all that happened there. And then in 1596, so 2 years later, John Stuart, who was the Master of Orkney, was charged with consulting with witches for the destruction of the Earl of Orkney. So that's him being, John Stuart being accused in the same murder plot. He was tried in Edinburgh this time and not Orkney, but was acquitted. And the evidence that was led to the execution of Alison Balfour was thrown out of court on the basis that it had been obtained under torture. So, Claire, maybe you could talk a wee bit about that, the difference between Edinburgh and Orkney, and this issue about whether the evidence is safe or not.
Yeah, I mean, the idea any evidence obtained under any form of duress is proper evidence is a ridiculous one, because when people are put under stress physically and mentally, they will confess to things that they haven't done. And in fact, although sometimes people think, well, you wouldn't, would you? You would just keep quiet. You would just say nothing, particularly in the modern day when we have, in theory, all these safeguards, which means that people can't be physically tortured, and in theory also that they can't be mentally tortured either, or not even tortured, mentally weighed upon to confess to things. People still do. So this woman, Alison Balfour, who did not confess under such serious torture and seeing her members of her family being tortured, must have been a woman of incredible strength, incredible mental strength, to have kept that up. And of course, it was only when what happened to her daughter that she broke, and no doubt very understandably. What is particularly galling about this case, and galling doesn't even express a tenth of what I'm feeling, is that what happened was Alison was tortured, she confessed, and then on that confession she was killed. But when John Stuart went to trial on the basis of an allegation of witchcraft having been implicated in the whole case, he was acquitted because it was thought that Alison's testimony ought not to have been used because it had been obtained under torture. So he was acquitted of the witchcraft charge. Now, the only difference that I can see between these cases is that Alison's case happened in Orkney, and the case of John Stuart, the Master of Orkney, he was tried in Edinburgh. Now, in Edinburgh, at least by the time that this trial took place, there was already a great anxiety about the number of witchcraft trials that were taking place. And there was also an anxiety about the physical torture that was being used to extract confessions from people. So in one view, I'm really, really pleased to see that the case of John Stuart ended so well, with his case being chucked out because part of the evidence against him, the evidence of Alison Balfour, was obtained under torture. But of course, that didn't work for poor Alison herself, who ended up obviously being strangled and burned. The only real difference that I can think of here is that because the case took place in Edinburgh, the centre of the legal world at that time in Scotland, and I suppose to some extent our most senior court, the appeal court, sits in Edinburgh now, the difference possibly was that they had already become very anxious about the idea of people being physically tortured in such a way, and therefore they threw the evidence out about the torture. But the difficulty was that whilst they were doing that, that wasn't happening across the whole of Scotland. And there were clearly places all over Scotland where people were still being tortured, confessing under torture, and that was being used to kill them. So we can see that there's a huge disparity between the way people were getting, inverted commas, justice at that time in Scotland. And a very, very sad case indeed.
We should say at this point as well that we're indebted to a website, orkneyjar.com, where we got all that information from. That's a really fascinating read, really well put together and very clearly researched. Definitely worth going and having a look, because it takes you down kind of a rabbit hole of lots of other stories as well. So go and check out orkneyjar.com.
Yeah, there are other trials there as well, and they've got, as they say, documented accounts and trials, and would highly recommend you going to look there. And I think we'll revisit this website and some of the information inside. I cannot wait, Zoe, until we're able to go up to Orkney and see the memorial that was there. That's really one of the things I really, really want to do later in the year, if that's going to be possible.
Yeah, definitely.
So this week what we want to do is round up a lot of stuff that we've been speaking to about on social media, and also bring some new things to our listeners' attention so that you can go and have a listen to them. The first is that we're really indebted to Alison Shaw. You can find her on Twitter at North Sea Witch. She brought to our attention an interview that she'd done with a musician called Karen McCrindle Warren about her pibroch, a lament for the Highland bagpipes, which was composed as a memorial to women executed as witches. She interviewed her, and I would definitely recommend you to go and look at Alison's site. We've retweeted it on Twitter, so if you find us on Twitter, you'll be able to find it. But Alison interviews Karen McCrindle Warren, and she explains that the tune was commissioned by Stephen Rookledge of the Shasta Piping Society of California. He asked for a remembrance piece for what is quoted as, quote, the devastating witch trials that took place during the 16th and 17th centuries. A lament to the accused, if you will. So it's amazing that someone from over in California has looked at our history and seen it and commissioned this beautiful piece of work. So I would definitely recommend that people head over to North Sea Witch's page, where there's lots of other interesting stuff as well, but in particular what caught our eye and what she shared with us is the beautiful lament to the people accused of witchcraft. And we will share a bit of the music at the end. And the reason why we'll share the music at the end is because in the interview, Karen McCrindle Warren was asked about the piece of music, and she says that the music is freely available to anyone who wishes to listen, use it in memorials, or learn to play it. So we will end today's show somewhat differently with a little bit of that lament. But for the full story and for the full interview, head over to North Sea Witch and you can see the detail of that. The music itself is, as the bagpipes can be, beautifully haunting. I really think it has the effect that you would want it to have when you're thinking about a pibroch, when you're thinking about a lament, which is you really reflect upon what happened to these women, and the sort of the discordant music really works in that way. I suppose the bagpipes aren't necessarily known for being jolly. Well, are they? Would I get into trouble there? Are they not known for being jolly?
They can make you feel quite, wound up and excitable, and I think.
Yeah, because when as soon as I said that, I thought, oh, well, wait a minute. Remember the Red Hot Chili Pipers? They're really...
And also Kaylee's, like weddings and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, I suppose maybe it's just my favourite bagpipe music is the ones which sound more haunting. The ones that you sound as if someone's playing them on a lone hill. That kind of...
That's because in your soul, Claire, you're a pure goth.
That is absolutely true. It's not only just my soul, it's leaked out everywhere else as well.
Leading on from that story, we've got some other news as well, Claire, don't we, that's sort of in a similar ballpark?
Yes, we were absolutely delighted to see an article that appeared recently in The Scotsman, which told us about a new project for 2021. This is a project which is started by Rachel Newton and Lauren McCall. They are starting what they describe, and I'll just quote here, as a multidisciplinary work paying humanising tribute to those persecuted in the 16th and 17th century Scottish witch trials. while also exploring historical beliefs in the supernatural and modern day parallels in our society. And they go on, an artistic response to the current campaign for a pardon and memorial to those accused in the trials. The work will be inspired by and in remembrance of real women who were persecuted and tried as witches, and characters from folkloric tales and mythology enshrined in our oral culture. So it's absolutely fantastic that Rachel and Lauren have been inspired by the campaign to pardon the witches and are bringing to Scotland this new cultural project. And I couldn't have been more delighted when I saw that they were doing this, because I just think we need to use every possible tool at our disposal to amplify the voices of these women and men who were killed as witches, and to bring what justice to them we can. And I think a major cultural response such as this is so pleasing. I was quite chuffed. Were you, Zoe?
Yes, it's great. It's great to hear, and I'll be very interested to see how the project develops. And I think it'll be really interesting to see sort of the broadening engagement as well. We definitely noticed that when the news was put out about this new project, there was a lot of engagement from people, again, with our Twitter account, saying that they were really interested and were finding there was so much that they hadn't been taught necessarily in school. So I think anything that helps to broaden the knowledge culturally in Scotland about it, to make sure that people know about it, I think is good for us as a country. And again, there was very little negativity, but there was one person, a couple of people in particular, men, who said that they didn't understand what the thinking was on it, that, you know, these people were dead, what would be the good of an apology, and so on. And I think I want to come back to that again. I think it's really important as a country that we face up to things that were done wrongly in the past and that we wouldn't do now or again in the future.
Zoe, I could not agree more. I bring it back to that sort of jokey way that we speak when people say, oh, God, if I was about in those times, I would have been killed as a witch. There's an underlying feeling with so many women that you speak to, and you know, we'll maybe do that tweet again. We'll maybe ask again, who thinks that they would have been killed as a witch? And you know, it's a bit jokey, but there's an underlying feeling in so many women that if you do step out of the norm in any way, if you put your head above the parapet, then you are fair game for comment. And of course, social media just exacerbates that greatly.
If you put into Twitter, if you go into the search bar on Twitter, I know that Twitter is obviously for, you know, many things it is great and it's a really nice place of connection, but there are many areas of Twitter that are disgusting and brings out the absolute worst in people. But if you put into the search in Twitter the word witch, I think you would be not at all surprised, but definitely disgusted by a lot of the things that come up. The word is still used routinely to particularly be used against women, particularly in politics. And it's done in a really diminishing way to say that, well, this woman is a witch, and all the sort of the attendant imagery with that. It's a massive shutdown, and it really needs to be dealt with. And we need to just stop being so stupid as a nation.
Isn't it funny that there are two parallel views of the word witch now? There's the use of the word witch in usually condemnation of a woman, but there's this new sort of witch army, these hundreds and thousands of people who now identify themselves as witches. It would be really, really nice to try and engage those people that identify themselves with witches to counter the way that the word witch is being used by other people. I suppose it would be really interesting. I saw also on social media, there's another site that we follow on Instagram, and I've actually spoken, and it might even be worthwhile us speaking again and asking if she might come and speak to us. It's the person who set up a website called Witch With Me, and she posted something recently on her website, which was, it just said in a black screen with white writing, "Witches Against Fascism," and it had over 4,000 likes. And I was amazed and delighted that there was this sort of, I don't know, counterculture of people identifying themselves as witches that were, you know, agreeing with that sentiment. I thought it was amazing, particularly the number of people that liked it. I just thought was quite amazing, and I was pleased to see it.
We've got one other thing here as well that is, again, it's engagement from social media. So this is one of the examples where it's been a really positive and nice thing. is we had somebody in touch. I'm actually sure if we know that this woman's actual name, but she's right, and I'll stumble over this because it's a bit of a tongue twister, but her name on her handle on Twitter is I knew I wasn't going to be able to say it. Occupational therapist, like occupational therapist, except it's occult at the beginning. And she sent us something really useful, which was the other week, I think it was a couple of episodes ago, we were talking about the kind of the physical logistics of this sort of renouncing your baptism by supposedly, if you'd been, accused and decided that you were a witch, of putting your hand on your head and on your foot at the same time. And she's found something actually in F. Marion McNeill's book, The Silver Bough, in the first volume of that collection. So F. Marion McNeill was a Scottish writer who did various things. And one of the things was that she wrote down, she wrote several books, several volumes that were about Scottish folklore. And so the page we've had a photograph sent to us by occupational therapist.
I should say, if anyone wants to look at her page herself, she has a slightly easier handle. If people want to go and actually read the post, they can see it on our website. We've retweeted her tweet, but they can also go and see her. She's at Mega, MEGA _melt, MELT. So they can look at it there as well, or follow our link to her page where they can see it.
The picture that she sent us from the book, The Silver Bough, is headed up Admission Rights, and it says, free consent was necessary for admission to membership of the witch cult. The rites included the formal renunciation of the Christian faith, the baptism, the kiss, asculum infame, and the marking. The marking was obviously some form of tattooing, the devil biting or nipping some spot, usually on either the shoulder or the hand, until the blood came, in such a way that when the wound healed, the mark, variously red or blue, became indelible. And then it says in brackets, the witch hunters invariably searched for the, quote, devil's mark, then followed the profession of faith and the vow of fidelity. Isabel Gowdy of the Aldern Moray Coven, giving evidence in 1662, said, I denied my baptism and did put the one of my hands to the crown of my head and the other to the sole of my foot, and then renounce it all betwixt my two hands to the devil. I mean, obviously, we would take issue with this issue about her giving evidence. I mean, it's not really giving evidence. She's probably saying what she thought they wanted to hear, probably after a period of sleeplessness or deprivation of some form, or possibly even physical torture. Yeah, so, we'd have a different sort of look at it these days, but that is what is written down as supposedly her evidence.
But it shows that you were right and I was wrong, because I thought it was the devil that put his hand on her head and on her foot to rinse it. But you were right. It is the slightly more physically difficult, as you were trying to describe, one hand on your head and one hand on your foot, and that appears to be signifying that you're renouncing all between his two hands to the devil. So you're renouncing your baptism and you're giving from the crown of your head to the sole of your foot to the devil.
The thing is, with a modern eye to this, and with all that we've talked about with the deprivation and the torture and so on, the fact that this has been reported as something that they did as a widespread thing, we've absolutely no idea about that. Isabel Gowdy might have just made that up on the spot, to give it credence to what she was saying, so that presumably in the hope that she wouldn't be executed. So, I mean, I don't know how widely that even happened. Maybe that's just her invention at the time.
Well, no, the thing is, from what
you read it in other places.
From what I've read so far, there's recurrent themes of the devil's mark, because of course people were stripped when they were accused of witchcraft by people investigating, inverted commas, and their bodies were checked to see whether or not they had any devil's mark, any blemishes, any birthmarks, anything. They were attributed to the devil's mark. But also people did repeat this phrase. What was important was that you renounced your baptism. That was crucially important to those of faith, because you couldn't have somebody who was baptised intellectually simultaneously doing the work of the devil and being a witch. So they had to ensure that anybody that was a witch had renounced their baptism. And that was important. That was the turning away from God and the going towards the devil. So part of their, as it were, investigative remit would to be ensure not only the woman confessed to being a witch, but also that she confessed to turning away from God and leaving her baptism. So it's not uncommon to find this about the devil putting his hands upon you, putting his hands upon her head, your head. And it's symbolic of the renunciation of baptism, I think.
Yeah, no, I totally get that. But as we are sort of making the point that most of these women weren't witches at all, it just seems to be just a fiction that was made up to suit just propaganda, basically.
Oh yeah. But what was happening was what they wanted to do when a woman was convicted of witch, they wanted to make a huge public show of it because they wanted to out the devil. They also wanted to show anyone who thought,
Mm-hmm.
"Oh, I might just turn to the devil. That looks like fun." However they
Yeah.
think that, they wanted to make a show of these people that were being convicted, and so those stories of the confession would be read out and would be made public. And then, I mean, if you think these were people whose lives were all about stories. They didn't have books, they didn't have TV, they didn't have, so their whole entertainment was history, was stories. So these sorts of stories would spread like wildfire, and everyone would then know, oh right, okay,
Yeah.
the way that the devil is renounced is he touches you, he puts a mark on you, and the stories just evolved through there. Because if you were being told that you're a witch, you were being told that you'd renounced the devil, and they said, how do you do it? Well, in an effort to stop being abused by torture, you would then say, oh, he put his hand on my head and his hand on my foot. And
Mm-hmm.
that's how I think these stories grew, so that we see them all over the country in different places that wouldn't necessarily have much to do with one another, but stories travel as well as people. We have one final update to give you before we finish the podcast today. You'll recall on a number of occasions that we've spoken about Lilius Eadie of Curis and the memorial of the witches' trio there, and the work done by Kate Stewart and Remembering the Accused Witches of Scotland. And we're absolutely delighted to let you know that we've been in contact with Douglas Spears, who has indicated to us that he will be happy to come on and go do a bit of a deep dive into parts of the history of Lilius Eadie. So we're very much looking forward to that. I think there's the idea, Zoe, that we have Douglas back a few times as well, just so we can get a bit more in depth into various parts of the story.
Yeah, I think that we'll get as much information as we can from Douglas, because the amount of information that he's got through his work as an archaeologist, and specifically about the Lilius Eadie case, is fantastic. It's so interesting that we'll just get as much information as we possibly can from him, and it'll be a dry husk of a man at the end of it. Not a threat, Douglas.
Well, not a threat. Thank you so much for listening to episode 16 of Witches of Scotland. Zoe, do you want to do our usual request of our listeners?
Yes, please do engage with us on social media. So we're on, obviously, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Please get in touch. But also, most importantly, please share with people as well, because the more people that we have involved and on board with the campaign, the greater chance we have of success.
Yes, thank you very much for listening to us again, and we look forward to hearing more of your updates on social media over the course of this week. We look forward to bringing you more exciting stuff in episode 17. So as we said earlier on, we want to end by playing you a small part of the music of Karen McCrindle Warren, her pibroch about the women who were executed as witches. The tune is a particular memorial for women executed in Dumfries in 1659. And before we hear a short part of that music, we just want to name those women. They were executed on the 13th April 1659. There were 9 Galloway women executed in Dumfries, and their names are Agnes Combs, Janet McGowan, Jean Thompson, Margaret Clark, Janet McKendrick, Agnes Clark, Janet Corson, Helen Moorhead, and Janet Callan. And we now invite you to listen to a short excerpt of the music.